today. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks to those of you who are observing our meetings today. We will be doing public comment. I'll run through the agenda in just a moment about when. So thanks for being with us. Thanks, councilors, for being with us today. Secretary Klauser, any words of welcome? And then I'm happy to do the agenda if you'd like me to.
No, I'm happy to have, welcome, everyone. It's the word of welcome. I'm happy to have you run through the agenda, David.
Great. Okay, super. And we'll throw those links in the chat if they're not already there. And so we've got quite an interesting meeting today. Let me share my screen with what you should be able to see this. In addition to Dave Pelletier here from the VTrans to talk about the transportation equity framework, which is, I'm interested to hear what's going on there, and that can be a good reflection for us this morning. It gives us a nice tee up to one of our main conversations today, which is the transportation recommendations. And here the transportation task group leads will be showing their work, and we will be, as a council, trying to make a decision on this, and we'll talk during that agenda period what that decision might look like. Right, so that's a big piece of today. We've invested an hour of that for that conversation, and that's an important decision-making moment for you as a council. We're going to do public comment after that, which is currently scheduled right around 12:25. Okay, and when we get back from a break, we can do any reflection we want to do on that public comment. Then, in the second block of time, we've got three things we're trying to do, which could be ambitious, but if we're all hanging in there, we should be able to do this. One is Jane got a response from the Joint Fiscal Office asking for some additional prioritization on those detailed recommendations we sent over. And we need, as a council, to make a plan about how to do that. We are not trying to prioritize during this meeting. We need a plan about how to respond to this request. So we're going to spend just 20 minutes or so figuring out a response and how we're going to work with the subcommittees and others to address this request. Second, we're going to get an update from the biomass task group. This is not a decision-making moment for us or for you as a council. This is an opportunity for the biomass group to say, this is where we're at, this is what we're doing, here's some draft outputs, and we look forward to giving you more detail in a subsequent meeting. Okay, so again, not decision-making, but we wanted to get some visibility on how the biomass task group is making progress. And finally, we wanted to spend a little bit of time, we've just put in 15 minutes here, about some initial thoughts on what that January report to the legislature should look like that the council has to do every year. And this is something that came up in the steering committee. And this is some initial thinking about what do we want this report to look like? How can we provide some initial structure right now about it? Okay, some additional public comment at the end of the meeting, and then we adjourn it too. That's what we've got on deck for today. Some good meaty stuff. Before we dive into it, I see Bram, you have got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks. Two related questions. The first is the order of the council's decision on the transportation piece versus public comment. I wonder, would it be valuable to reverse those and get public comment before we make a decision so we can incorporate what we hear into that decision? One question. And the second question is whether we have sort of defined the process by which newly adopted pieces of the climate plan get incorporated into the plan. There is the plan document in its adopted form as of last December 1st, and it seems to me that we will be adopting things along the way, like the transportation piece. If we decide to adopt that today, how does that get incorporated? Does it get noted as having been adopted at a different time? Does the original report stay as it is with appendices? And I think it would be good to have clarity on that.
Great. Thanks, Bram. Could we leave the second piece of that second question to when we're talking about the transportation piece, and we can put it out there as one of the decisions point for you as a council. Is that all right?
Sure.
And then the first piece, the procedural run, a specific request of shifting the public comment before you actually make a decision. I am certainly open to that. Does anyone here among the counselors have a concern about shifting that public comment a little earlier to then have your decision-making moment be after the public comment? Any concerns with Bram's proposal? Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any concerns. Let's just make sure we shift that up and we get to public comment a little earlier so we don't crush our time for the decision-making. Nice, Bram, thanks. And let's not leave that second question you have. I just want to take it up when we're talking about specifically how we're going to handle the transportation. Okay, great. Any other questions or concerns on the agenda? Great. Okay, let's dive in. And thanks everyone. And just as a quick reminder on process stuff, as we always do here on these Zoom calls, this is one happy Zoom call. We're all in here together, whether you're observing the meeting or you're a climate counselor. We ask climate counselors, if you're in a position to do this, to keep your camera on because it helps us feel like we're actually interacting. And if you're observing our conversation today, to kindly keep your camera off until the public comment period. And the same goes for the chat. We ask you kindly refrain from using chat unless you're a climate counselor until the public comment period. That's just how we're trying to manage the Zoom as we go. Okay, so the first thing is approving the minutes from October 17th. They are linked in the agenda document. I'll give folks a moment if you need to click through and remind yourself of those minutes. Great. Any concerns about the minutes from October 17th, or anybody want a little bit more time to just review them? Okay, I'm not seeing any concerns or a request for more time, so let's treat those minutes as approved. Thanks, everybody. So let's get into our just transition reflection with Dave Pelletier. And Dave, if you want to introduce yourself, and I'll just turn it over to you to walk us through the equity framework for transportation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Dave Pelletier. I work in the policy and planning section at the Agency of Transportation, work for Michelle Boomhauer in the policy planning and intermodal development division. And I'm the project manager for AOT for the development of the transportation equity framework. And I'm going to do my best to cover a fair amount of ground. So in the amount of time that we have, you have a very full agenda. So I won't go terribly deep at any point, but we'll be able to take questions along the way or wait till the end, whatever your preference is. I do want to try to share my screen here. Let's see. And we'll get into the beginning. Is that appearing well for folks? Excellent. All right, thank you. So I'll preface this presentation with the fact that we are at a transition point in this process right now. We've kind of done all of our homework and our field work and our public input. We're right at that junction where we're distilling it all and figuring out what we've learned, looking at a gaps analysis, and kind of moving into the development of recommendations and strategies. So if it seems like this presentation is sort of heavy on what process and what we've done and kind of short on answers and where to from here, that's why. I'd be happy to come back at a later point in the process, or we can certainly present the final report this winter when it's due. But just a little bit of a caveat in terms of the presentation. So I'll talk a little bit about the equity framework assignment. Out of the way there. And a little bit of context, and then again, a little bit of the content and what we're anticipating to be kind of the bulk of the report, the meat of the report, and then next steps. So the transportation bill really of the 2021 Legislative Assembly included Section 41, which was a directive for the Agency of Transportation consultation with the regional planning commissions as our partners to develop this transportation equity framework report. We shall undertake a comprehensive analysis of the state's transportation programs, really from planning to development to implementation and monitoring, and develop a recommendation on an equity framework through which our investments, our planning, really are all of the work that we do, including program and project development, can be evaluated, as well as the prioritization of all of those projects and programs to advance mobility equity, which in this legislative language defined it as transportation system that increases access to mobility options, reduces air pollution, and enhances economic opportunity for Vermonters that have traditionally been underserved by the state's transportation system. There's more language to this piece of legislation, but these are kind of the key elements in terms of the development of this framework. And of course, if anybody has any questions, please speak up or someone call them out for me as I'm using a single screen and just seeing my presentation at this point. So just a quick mention of context for all of this. At the same time, or just about the same time as that, that directive from the Vermont legislature of the agency and the RPCs, we had Executive Order 13895, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities to the federal government, which is really, and again, I'm going to go an inch deep and a mile wide on this and oversimplify things, but it essentially directed all federal agencies to incorporate equity into their work and the actions that they take. Soon after that, the Justice 40 initiative was announced. And again, an oversimplification, but the goal of that initiative is that 40% of the benefits of infrastructure investments with a focus on clean energy, efficiency, clean transit, and affordable housing are distributed to disadvantaged communities. About a year ago exactly, to today's date, was the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Pretty much unprecedented level of investment in infrastructure and transportation in particular for the United States. All of which are, much of which is subject to these two first blocks that I introduced, that Executive Order and Justice 40 initiative. And then subsequent to that, more of a tangible and kind of action-oriented level, the USDOT introduced an equity action plan with specific pillars of wealth creation, technical support for communities that have struggled in the past to take advantage of federal opportunities, empowerment and decision-making for those that have been marginalized or not empowered to take part in the planning and project implementation process, and expansion of access to affordable transportation. And the connection to the USDOT strategic plan, which is a broader plan, is that equity plan is one of, I think, 5 or so pillars of that strategic plan. So all this to say, equity is really a strong foundation of much of the work that we are doing in transportation, and that the Federal Highway Administration and the other federal agencies are asking us to do in developing our plans and projects and programs. And I will point out 2 things. I wasn't successful in providing this presentation to you all in advance, but I will package it up afterward. And these links are live in these blocks for you to take a look at these pieces of information. I would encourage you to take a look at the equity action plan and the strategic plan. They're brief and very to the point, worth spending a few minutes taking a look at. Now back to ground level here for our purposes. The Transportation Equity Framework is a plan that describes the roles, responsibilities, and expectations for AOT and the RPCs as we're doing our work. It's mostly focused on external activities. It's how we do our business and provide our services and conduct our work. And we intentionally developed it with meaningful engagement and emphasis on including those who have not traditionally really had a place at the table and have been historically disadvantaged and not really able to participate so much, which is a big part of this entire subject moving forward. And that is really connecting with and developing longer term relationships with those communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Just look quickly at working group composition and the tasks that we've been working on to date. This is the composition of the working group that's guided the work thus far. We've had 3 of our 6 working group meetings. We have a 4th coming up on December 1st. I should add also that Michelle Boomhauer here is really the project champion or sponsor within our agency. So she is very much part of this working group as well. And you'll just note that we have some very key representation from within the agency in terms of leadership roles, both within VTrans and within the Department of Motor Vehicles. We have representation from CCRPC in the MPO area in Chittenden County, as well as a regional or a rural RPC with Addison County. And then also representation from Agency of Natural Resources through Harry Hensenberg for the very close connection to environmental justice and the work that will be ongoing cooperatively through the rolling out and implementation of the state environmental justice legislation that was passed this previous session. This is the very high level task list for this work. We are right at that stage 4 right now, where, like I alluded to earlier, we're rolling up all of the task 3 engagement information and all of the kind of homework and public participation and stakeholder discussions that we've had. And we'll hold that up against best practices and develop a gaps and needs assessment. And then we'll be moving into some recommendations and implementation in the framework itself in the next couple of months, with the goal of completing the work largely by February. I want to spend just a few minutes, if I could, on the stakeholder and public engagement or public involvement aspects of the project, because they're fundamental to not only the development and the kind of the accurate understanding of how to implement this project, but they're also part of our work in developing the longer standing relationships that it's going to take to implement the strategies that we've identified. So there are 3 main pillars of stakeholder and public involvement in the process. There was direct engagement, stakeholder interviews or stakeholder engagement as we have it here, and then there were regional planning commission hosted regional meetings. And I will get into just a few slides on to give a little more detail in each of these. Direct engagement activities, we identified through the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index what we believed would be 4 really key communities in terms of figuring out what the needs are, how to best engage, and how to move forward with the equity framework. Those were Winooski, Burlington, with a focus on BIPOC young adult communities. The Northeast Kingdom with a focus on elderly mobile home residents. Bennington, we focused on a couple of significant low-income housing communities down there. And then in Rutland, we focused on low-income individuals and those who are or underhoused. And there was a broad range of strategies that were implemented to do this work. Some of which will be recommendations in terms of how to continue engaging on these populations that we are trying to do a better job to provide services and projects for the benefit of. The stakeholder interviews were a set of 10 really in-depth interviews. And this is the list of organizations and contacts that we conducted this process with. You see there are 4 agencies external to the organization or to the Agency of Transportation that we connected with. There are a couple of key representatives here, Charlie Baker and Catherine Dimitrick, representing the Agency of Planning Development agencies. And then within the Agency of Transportation, we tried to be very strategic in terms of really conducting interviews with folks that were in really key positions in terms of delivery, again, of implementation and delivery of the strategies and follow through for the equity framework. RPC engagement, we don't need to go through the text that's on here, but suffice to say, we visited all 11 regional planning commissions, typically through the venue of their Transportation Advisory Committee meeting with other staff and other community members invited as appropriate. Some regions have equity committees. So went out and really multi-purpose to create awareness of the project and the subject area in some cases, to understand what the regions are already doing in terms of public outreach and engagement and other actions that are related to equity in the transportation planning and implementation process, and to build hopefully longer term and durable relationships between the agency and RPC with respect to equity and kind of further into the communities in each of the regions. And just a little foreshadowing there, what we saw was a real range of knowledge and understanding and practices, but a solid commitment, as the RPCs really always do show, in partnership in developing this work and implementing it.
Dave, I'm just going to butt in for 1 second to give you a
Please
quick
do.
check. And we are rapidly approaching that 15-minute mark, and I just want to give you a heads up on that.
Perfect. I just got a couple slides left. I just want to foreshadow kind of the framework that we're looking at. It should look a little bit familiar to some of you in terms of these pillars of equity that we're going to build strategies under: distributive, procedural, contextual, and corrective. And the questions that are asked below relate to each of those blocks. And they are really the fundamental questions that we're trying to answer in the framework and provide strategies for us to work towards addressing where we find that there are shortcomings. And last couple slides here. Really the ellipse that you see in the middle is just capturing all of that engagement work that we've been doing. We're right at that vertical red hatched line where we're turning all of that information into knowledge, learning, and hopefully some solid strategies and next steps. And here's a project webpage that you can take a look at. My contact information is here if you want to chat offline about any of this or get more information. And with that, I will stop presenting. Let me get back here.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. That's very interesting. And as you note, it's a key moment for you as you're pivoting from the sort of going out and listening and now trying to turn that into your framework. Any quick questions of follow-up for Dave on this and what's going on over there at VTrans with this?
And I will, as I mentioned, I will present or provide the presentation for folks to take a look through and take a look at some of those links afterwards as well.
Great. Sue, go ahead, please. Hang on, Sue, you're still on mute.
Sorry. I want to just start by saying thank you so much for this work and presentation. I am wondering, you didn't mention in terms of federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm wondering whether we've explored that or are exploring that as an opportunity to address some of these equity challenges that VTrans faces, particularly with respect to rural transit and electric vehicle transformation.
Yeah, that's notably absent from the presentation based on the date of the development of most of this material. But yes, we are looking at that. Cost of HAPIS is, as you know, pouring through that closely. And we'll be working together as we wrap this process up to make sure that we fold those opportunities into this as well.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks, Dave. Fantastic to have that knowledge of what's going on. It seems so relevant, and it's actually a great way to pivot into the work that the council has to do right now around its transportation recommendations. So, Dave, thank you so much, and thanks for your offer of making the slides available.
Thank you for having me, David. Pleasure to see you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. You're
Bye-bye.
welcome to stick around or dive off as you choose. You still are sharing your screen, so you might want to stop doing that. There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. Okay, fantastic. So that is a good frame for what we need to do now, which is to look at the recommendations coming out of the Transportation Task Group, and then make some decisions around it. And Bram had asked the question of, well, hang on a second, what does it look like for us to adopt new content into our climate action plan? Let's keep that question alive as we're working through this conversation, and there'll be a moment where we talk about what we're actually agreeing to do. Before we get to that moment, let's hear what these recommendations are, and let's hear from the task group about what's going on in them. And so I think, Joey, you're going to be on deck for doing that, and presenting what you're bringing to the council and the kind of decision points that we as a council, or you as a council, need to be thinking about with this content.
Sure. I'm happy to start. Thanks, David, and agree. Thank you, Dave, for that presentation, and more so to everyone who's doing this transportation equity framework and this important work that is a very important and good precursor to this conversation, and certainly a framework that ideally is going to help us transform transportation in rural Vermont in the most equitable way possible. So thank you. So before I talk about the memo and the suggested next steps and update, and I will invite any of my fellow task group members to weigh in, but just grounding us again in where we're at. So again, last December, just days before we were poised to adopt the climate action plan, a primary recommendation of ours to make certain steps to more equitable progress in the transportation sector, the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program, a regional cap and invest program that Vermont has been at the table, helping to develop for the past decade plus, was put on ice, for lack of a better way of saying it, when at least two of the core states that had committed in the MOU pulled out, Connecticut, Massachusetts. So we're left scrambling for a primary recommendation that was going to, sort of really, again, begin to ratchet down emissions in the transportation sector. So we quickly at that time modified the climate action plan, saying that we should pursue TCIP if it becomes regionally viable again. And then at the same time, continue to advance the other recommendations that we had noted, and also explore other potential policy or regulatory tools to, again, make sure that we significantly reduce emissions in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act in the transportation sector. So we began that work in earnest in January. We developed a memo to ground us and others in where we currently stand, what we think is needed to pursue and to further explore. We outlined a set of criteria we thought any policy or regulatory tool should achieve, which is included, greenhouse gas emission reductions, the sort of cost per ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduced or avoided, other really critical, criteria like making sure that, equity in terms of more equitable access and program delivery and, benefits go to lower income, historically marginalized Vermonters. So we outlined a set of criteria, and then we sort of outlined the different characteristics of other policy, those policy and regulatory approaches, their shortcomings, their characteristics, et cetera. And then as a task group, we developed another memo, which outlined sort of a process and a public engagement strategy to refine our thinking and the set of recommendations that we'd want the Climate Council to consider. As a reminder, in the adopted CAP, we had set forth a delivery of a suggested set of recommendations in June. We pushed that deadline back to November to now having this conversation with you all to support greater public engagement, public input, et cetera. Clearly, there's more work to do there, but we gave ourselves a little bit more time to benefit from more thinking of others. So we did a series of public engagement events in the spring and the summer. We hosted weekly transportation task group meetings. Those were made public, and all of that culminated in a memo that we developed for action and considered as a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee in September. The cross-sector mitigation subcommittee unanimously agreed to lift up that memo that we discussed in September to you all. And we briefly discussed that memo and its contents and sort of directionally what we thought we should do in our September meeting. And David, you took sort of a pulse of Climate Council members in terms of directionally, does this seem right? There seemed to be some solid support for directionally, and yet also interest in further input on the approach and the recommendations. So, and a lot of that input came from members of the administration, which we worked to weave in and incorporate the thinking from the administration folks and from ongoing conversations as a task group. So we refined the memo, and now we have the memo before you for consideration. We discussed that at our last cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting, and we did our best to incorporate a lot of very constructive, very useful feedback, and I think positive changes that Secretary Moore and Secretary Flynn and others had really made to, I think, really improve the action items and the next steps. A lot of that is reflected in the memo that you have before you today. So we took that input, incorporated it into the memo, and then we discussed it again at cross-sector and had unanimous agreement among non-executive branch appointees to advance this current memo up to you all for conversation and consideration today. So I want to talk about the sort of core components of really draw your attention to what's different in the memo and different in our approach than what's already in the climate action plan. But two things, and I'm going to ask anyone to weigh out before we discuss those next few things that I would note is that there are some significant endeavors underway right now, including the advancement of the Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks rules. It sounds like LCAR is going to be taking up Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks this Thursday, which is really meaningful and will be very impactful, which is phenomenal. So here's hoping that LCAR moves quickly on that. I would say Advanced Clean Cars, Advanced Clean Trucks is significant and yet still not sufficient, will not deliver pollution reduction progress in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act legally binding requirements, which are again in line with what the world's leading climate scientists have now long said, and many are now screaming, is absolutely essential to reduce planet warming pollution, and to mitigate the, impacts of a warming planet. So anyway, long story short, things like Advanced Clean Cars, Advanced Clean Trucks will be meaningful, significant, and not sufficient. And at the same time, I think, our interest, and we've been hearing a lot from and very committed to developing a more robust multimodal transportation system that does better at moving people and not just cars. So I think Advanced Clean Cars, Advanced Clean Trucks, real significant, but is one part of a transportation system that we need to be creating that serves everyone and also does that in a way that doesn't, that reduces our climate impact. So that's sort of a very broad frame. Before we talk about the specific things, I just would invite Gina as my task group co-lead. I can't see you on my boxes on the screen, but or Jared or anyone else in the transportation task group to sort of round out the context that I just wanted to set before we dig in.
Thanks, Joey. I think there's two important events that we hosted in our public involvement strategy, and that was we held well-attended webinars in coordination with the Clean Cities program on both cap and trade programs and transportation fuel standard. We heard from other states and provinces on those programs, and you all were invited to that. But I just want to remind everyone that that was part of the extensive outreach that we did over this summer.
Great.
And if it's all right, I'll just also add that folks will remember that over the winter and into the spring, including those public engagement, those webinars that Gina just spoke to, a big thing that the Transportation Task Group was doing was looking at other countries, states, provinces, policies, and records of achievement in terms of emissions reduction, and trying to understand the landscape of policy and regulatory options and programmatic options, and comparing that to one of the key criteria that we had set, which was being able to be confident that those policy options could achieve the scale and pace of emissions reductions as required in the law. So while that and so you saw an initial draft of that memo over the winter, an updated draft of that memo in March, which I'll just post that link again, that has a lot more of the background research and information about those various policies. And that was just another building block for the process that helped lead to these recommendations that I just want to remind folks of, especially those who haven't kind of followed the process from beginning to end.
That's great. Okay. So that's really helpful context. I think we need to dive into what's being put on the table today and understand the decision that the council is being asked to make today.
Yes. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Jared. Thanks, David. Maybe does it make sense to dive in with the very fancy one slide?
Yes.
As a
I think if
framing?
you've got an image, let's do that.
Oh, it's an image. Apologies for it being pretty succinct. Should I share my screen, or can Marion or Jane share the one slide just to sort of highlight the fundamentally like three things that are really core context and core content? Should I share? Or?
Marianne, are you able to share that slide? I'm not sure if she has it.
It's posted on the website.
Screens. I have it and can share. Give me 1 second.
Thank you. I'll also just drop it in the chat. But while Marion's pulling that up, thank you again. Essentially, what this slide distills, because we're throwing a lot at you, and is our attempt at sort of distilling what's new, what we think is needed to clarify forward direction, and what's new in terms of the moment we're in and the difference between things that have happened since we adopted the initial plan and what's happening now. So let me just cruise through these, and again, I would invite Gina or Jared and anyone else to round out, but wanting to highlight a new recommendation that was not in the climate action plan, which was to collect and analyze timely and accurate Vermont specific data, essentially establish a reporting system to set the table for to just make sure that we have the most sort of granular level of data regarding the volumes and types of different fuels used, essentially a foundational tool to design successfully any future policy or regulatory program. So develop a greenhouse gas emissions reporting program for the transportation sector to go further than the large federal data sets that we are currently using, again, to get more granular and analysis of what's happening in Vermont's transportation system related to greenhouse gas emissions, and fuel usage to improve the accuracy and timeliness of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that is prepared by the Agency of Natural Resources. So that is a new recommendation that we have put forward as something we recognize as fundamental and foundational to establishing a potential regulatory or policy approach that we may not have yet in the transportation sector. That's point number one. Point number two, we wanted to add more specificity to the recommendation that currently exists in the Climate Action Plan. As people may recall, when we adopted the Climate Action Plan in December, we, with the sort of shelving of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a regional cap and invest program, we recommended pursuing a comparable cap and invest program for transportation fuels, both in Vermont and regionally, or other policies and programs that reduce emissions and drive similar outcomes as anticipated by participating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. As Jared noted, we've spent, since January, doing more due diligence on what is working elsewhere, what are the core cornerstone characteristics of how other states, nations, and provinces are delivering greenhouse gas emissions reductions cost effectively, equitably. And what we thought was important to include is more specificity on that the more general recommendation that I just highlighted to you in the adopted cap. So we recommended clarifying that by including the language, the only currently known policy options for which there's strong evidence from other states, provinces, and countries to deliver at the scale and pace of emissions reductions in line with Global Warming Solutions Act is a combination of one or more of a cap and invest or cap and reduce policy covering transportation fuels or performance standard, a regulatory approach covering transportation fuels. So a little bit more specificity in teasing out that recommendation that we adopted in December. So those are sort of new, one new recommendation, one more nuanced recommendation, and importantly, wanted to just underscore for you this new effort that VTrans is undertaking as required by the federal infrastructure law. State agencies of transportation are required to develop a carbon reduction plan and a carbon reduction strategy. The VTrans team here in Vermont is hard at work on developing that plan and currently are in the process of a two-pronged endeavor. First prong looking at existing programs and their sort of efficacy in being able to deliver greenhouse gas emission reductions in the transportation space, and how we tool up existing programs and use existing revenues to make greater pollution reduction, equitable progress in the transportation sector. So this is a really important piece of work underway. That sort of analysis, I think, for looking at existing programs is likely to be, I believe, outlined in January, and I'll let Michelle or Andrea or others from VTrans speak to that more specifically. But then VTrans is also, I think, helpfully looking at, well, to inform the conversation that we're exploring with you all, what other policy or regulatory approaches are we going to need? They are doing with a consultant an analysis of different policy and regulatory approaches to make certain pollution reduction progress in the transportation sector. So it's on a bit of a different time scale. I think next fall is when that initial sort of analysis will be delivered, but it will be a very helpful, informative set of information to guide us in more concrete direction in terms of where we need to go. So that is a lot that I just threw at you. And I'm going to invite Gina or Jared or anyone else from, Jane, Andrea, VTrans to round out what I just shared.
Okay, great. So this is sort of highlights of the memo. These three things are the real jump out things of the memo. Okay. And I want to just circle back, in addition to having Gina and Jared, Joey, you had made a comment that this was unanimously sort of approved by the cross-sector folks who are the non-administration folks to come up here to the council. and sort of begs the question, what's going on with the administration folks? So I do want to create an opportunity for folks who, from the administration, whether Secretary Moore or others, to say a moment about what's going on from their perspective on this. And that's going to inform how you all want to make a decision about this. So why don't we do that right now? And I saw Secretary Moore, you just came off mute. Do you want to say a word about how you are seeing this and how the administration's seeing this?
Sure. So Secretary Flynn and I did send a memo to the Transportation Working Group, and I think Jane is going to try to post it on the website if she hasn't done so already, that just outlined our concerns and appreciative of the working group's efforts to incorporate a number of our suggestions into the recommendations. I think the crux of it is really around number 2. And this idea of stating that the only known policy option sort of driving us towards a cap and invest approach. I think we have concerns that are sort of twofold. One is that this gets out in front of the work VTrans is doing related to the development of a carbon reduction strategy and not fully being able to anticipate what the outcomes of that work are going to be. And then also that the Global Warming Solutions Act is pretty clear that it is directing us to identify initiatives, programs, and strategies that are cost effective. And that doesn't seem to be a term here. This is really about the policy options to achieve the emissions reductions requirements at pace without necessary consideration to cost effectiveness. So those are sort of the 2 high-level concerns. But as I say, I appreciate the way many of our other comments and suggestions have been folded into the recommendations presented here this morning.
Thanks, Secretary Moore. And just to be clear, this point number 1, the new recommendation about the data collection, is something that you all are supportive of, and the rest of the memo you're supportive of. You're concerned about that point number 2 and the way that's phrased.
Correct. I think point number 1, there's an open question about limiting it to the transportation sector. I recognize that that's sort of the purview of this working group, and it makes sense to have it phrased the way it's framed. But I do think that sort of thinking about the data we have available to us to support not only changes going forward in the transportation sector, but also around the thermal and building sector is kind of an open question. So, but appreciating this is a transportation working group, and so their recommendations are tailored accordingly.
Okay, great. Helpful. So folks from the transportation working group, are there other sort of key points you want to make about what's being put on the table before we have a discussion about the Climate Council sort of digesting this for a second, and then B, what are we actually doing here as a council? What's our action today? But is there anything else you want to say about this content before we sort of open it up to more conversation? Jared?
Thanks, David. And thank you, Secretary Moore, for the feedback you provided on the memo. And I'm glad that a lot of it was able to be incorporated in the bullet points. I do want to just offer a couple of thoughts in response to the 2 reasons that you mentioned for opposing the second part of this slide. On the first part, in terms of being out in front of the carbon reduction strategy, I just want to make sure, I know you know this, Secretary Moore, but I'm not sure if everyone is aware. I want to be clear that the carbon reduction strategy is required by the federal government to assess the emissions reduction impact of the different programs across VTran's budget. That's phase 1 of the work. And by the consultant's own admission, the results of that analysis are going to be that those programs are incredibly marginal in terms of, or the capital budget has an incredibly marginal effect on emissions reduction. Now, there is a phase 2 component of that study that the state thankfully added to the scope of work that seeks to give us additional information and analysis about kind of further refining policy options in the transportation space. But I do not think that that is at all in conflict with or opposed to the preliminary finding that we have all come to about having a high degree of confidence in achieving the scale and pace of emissions reduction. I mean, specifically when we noted that in that language in the recommendation says the only currently known, and I think we repeatedly asked folks to identify other currently known options that could achieve the same, and that was met with silence. So I think that we do have a responsibility to be clear about what policy options can work, and based on evidence and that has been proven from elsewhere. And those were the two that really rose to the top. Of course, there's other things that can be part of a complementary package that can help reduce emissions on the margin. But in terms of having certainty, clarity, it was really those two policies around a cap and or around a performance standard covering transportation fuels that for which there's significant evidence. And then I would just say on that second point, in terms of the cost effectiveness point, the very next line after that recommendation, and what our research also showed, is that you can design such policies in a cost-effective and equitable manner. So I think that question that was raised is addressed, and it was a key criteria for us. And I think that you can see that in the implementation of a number of those policies in other states that have consistently delivered emissions reductions in a cost-effective way, specifically less than the social cost of carbon, and oftentimes achieving lower energy costs than would have been the case even without accounting for the social cost of carbon, because we know how high and price volatile prices for gasoline and diesel are, and also doing so prioritizing investments to serve lower income and underserved communities, as we've seen, and especially in California and Oregon with their performance standards and cap programs. So just wanted to make sure to mention those pieces to round out the conversation.
Thanks, Jared. Bram, go ahead.
Thank you. I would just add two very brief nuances or expansions to a couple of points that Jared made. One is the statement in the memo that the only two currently known ways to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions that are required of us are either a cap, reduce, trade, invest program or performance standard. That's sort of simply a statement of objective fact. There are no other ways known to this council after almost 2 years of work and an immense amount of research. There are no other ways to achieve the reductions we need to at this point. Something new may appear, and that would be awesome. But right now, to this council as a group and all of the people involved, those are the only two ways. And secondly, I'd say each of those is a broad programmatic area, and the screen of cost effectiveness can be applied to all of the options within each of those to choose the most cost effective way of achieving those reductions. Thank you.
Thanks, Bram. Okay. Gina?
Yeah, I want to echo what Bram said, in that this statement is what we know right now, but it will tee up these two options in the VTrans study, second phase of the study. We want to make sure that these ideas get put into the VTrans study to do the deep dive. The devil will be in the details of how those programs are structured regarding cost effectiveness and all those really critical, important issues. So we're merely saying the climate plan says we must look at these types of programs. Here's what we know right now about what's feasible. And if there's anything else, please tell us. We need to assess where we are today more thoroughly, and we'll do that in the plan that VTrans is undertaking, and we'll better define what it is we're talking about. And there's just a ton of work to be done on that. We can't forget about this for another year. We need to keep it in the spotlight so that we can then begin to really define things.
Thanks, Gina. Michelle? Hang on, Michelle, you're still on mute.
There we go. Thank you. So I just want to recognize that I think we all are aware that the climate action plan that was adopted discussed the fact that there were a variety of policies that needed to be examined, and that the carbon reduction strategy and plan development, which the agency is undertaking, is the first step in advancing those plan recommendations as it relates to the transportation sector. As noted by Joey and Jared, the agency has engaged Cambridge Systematics as our consultant to aid in the development of the carbon reduction strategy and plan. They are a firm that had previously worked on the Transportation Climate Initiative at the regional level, and they also were key in working with the U.S. Department of Transportation in developing the framework for the activity of developing carbon reduction strategies at the DOT level. So I think I want to just clear up any misconceptions that from the outset of the agency writing the scope of work for this project, there was a phase 2 of this project contemplated. It's not an element that was added after the fact. And that, as I mentioned on page 80 of the CAP, there's language included that provides for other policy analysis and development. And the carbon reduction strategy development includes language that provides for the analysis of VTrans programs, as mentioned, and other policy and regulatory approaches. Thus, it's our perspective that the carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed for the state to have a full understanding of what additional targeted or sector-wide policy pieces will be effective and needed. So as a result, the task 3 of our strategy and plan development process is to have Cambridge Systematics develop 4 scenarios with different combinations of strategies, which include exclusively transportation investments and services, such as VTrans would include in its capital plan, as was mentioned, exclusively other policy and regulatory approaches, such as clean car and truck rules and incentives, low carbon fuel standards, fee-based carbon pricing, and transportation network company regulations. A combined scenario, which would include new revenue positive pricing measures, some portion of these funds which could be used to be reinvested in transportation projects and services. And this is similar to what Cambridge Systematics conducted for the TCI effort. And then finally, a variation or 2 on the scenarios, which may include some combination of the elements I mentioned above. And this activity will not be taking place in a vacuum. There'll be a technical and an advisory committee working on the development of the scenarios, and will be providing specific policy and strategy input. And the outcomes will address not only the carbon reduction, but the cost effectiveness of the strategies, as Secretary Moore mentioned, as a key component, as well as equity considerations and co-benefits such as health, economic effects, and factors that we have been focused on as the Climate Council. So, I guess one of our main concerns is that as our staff participated in both the Transportation Task Group meeting and the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting, the question was raised, what results would be achieved by including the proposed language and recommendations today versus, going through the implementation of the climate action plan with the activities we are undertaking. And then on what timeline would the recommendation placed before you today yield any desired outcome, which differs from, what's already been provided for in the CAP and is also anticipated to be provided through our carbon reduction analysis and strategy. So it's just feeling like a little bit of the cart before the horse from our perspective.
Okay, great. So quick before I go to you, Joey, I want to take stock of where we are. We've got a memo with a set of ideas inside of it, right? Of which it appears all of it except this one piece we're focusing on right now, which is one sentence, right? All of it appears to have the full support of everyone who has been involved in it from the transportation working group and the cross sector, right? So now we're kind of digging into this one piece, which there's different views on. And I just want to clarify that, because if there are other concerns outside of this one piece, let's make sure we don't lose those in the context of this conversation around this one sentence in the document, okay? And then we're going to have to quickly think about, what are we doing as a council? Are we voting on this memo? Are we agreeing that this memo should include the concerns that you're hearing from the administration? Or are we doing something else? And that'll get back to Bram's question as well, as what does it look like to have an addendum to the climate action plan? Joey, go ahead. But in that context, I want to make sure we don't get lost in just spending an hour debating this one line. We need to make a decision on what to do about the one line.
Mhm. No, I definitely do not want to spend a huge amount debating one line, but I guess two things. Michelle, just to make sure everyone is on the same page, can you laid out the carbon reduction strategy in that process. Can you highlight for folks the timeline of those deliverables again? Because the one question I have is, I think the work that you're doing will be important, and I think it will inform and put a finer point on the regulatory or policy approach that we ultimately potentially choose, informed by the work of Cambridge Systematics and ongoing, stakeholder engagement, public input, et cetera. I guess I would just first, if the timeline, that would be helpful for me, and I think maybe for others. And then I don't see the sentence in question as in conflict with that. I feel like they are synergetic. What we're saying is we need to do something more. And thank you, VTrans, for going deeper and hiring an informed consultant to put a finer point on what that more is. If folks can just distinguish for me why you view them as mutually exclusive as opposed to synergistic, that would be extremely helpful.
Thanks, Joey. The timeline for this effort is, as mentioned earlier, it's a two-phase effort. First, to analyze our capital program, but the more important work in the construct of this memo and the perceived work that was outlined in the climate action plan will be ongoing through 2020, the calendar year 2023, and we expect final outcomes at the end of 2023. I think that what is not clear to us is that we are taking up the work that was described as needed within the context of the climate action plan. So it's not clear why this memo would be needed in addition to the language that has already been articulated in the climate action plan to explore all variety of policies and policy measures which could be utilized to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector, which is what our study is doing. So it's really, it seems as though the memo centralizes and presupposes the outcome of a TCI type model and is not sort of recognizing the fact that the climate action plan has already come out with this specific recommendation, and this is what we're pursuing.
Okay, that's helpful to clarify that. Chris?
Yeah, I think it'd be great to hear from counselors who haven't been working on this and who aren't part of the administration, because I think people have been working on this for a while. And many thanks to the folk in the administration and Joey, and that I was part of a lot of the effort too. It'd be really good to see what you guys see here, because I think some folks, depending on their position, may be seeing things that or intents here that aren't necessarily there. To my mind, this letter was just a commentary to the public of Vermont, to the legislature and stakeholders and business and industry and everybody else, that here's what's needed in order to reach the transportation targets. Because they're not necessarily, paying deep attention to all the nuances about what exactly VTrans is doing or any other state agency. It's just a simple communication, and it doesn't seem to me to be kind of undermining or pushing, or it's just kind of reinforcing what came out of the cap. And now that we kind of know the lay of the land, here's what needs to happen. So it'd be great to hear from others about what they think this letter says and whether or not they support it.
That's great. Chris, I'll take you right up on that and say counselors who have been quiet so far in this meeting and haven't been as deeply into the work, when you look at this memo, you look at what it seems to everybody's in alignment with in cross-sector, this one point where there's concerns. And Rich, I'm not going to go to you first if someone else is there, because I know you've been deeply involved in this through cross-sector, but if someone else who is reacting to this and wants to offer some views. All right, Rich, go ahead.
So I was not actually involved in drafting this memo, but was involved in the cross-sector meeting where we discussed it. And it's helpful for anyone who hasn't been involved to understand. And David, I'm just reinforcing your point that what we're talking about is whether the memo should be amended to remove basically a simple statement. And the simple statement is that we are not aware of any other experience in other states or regions or nations where emission reductions of the scale required by the GWSA have been accomplished without a firm transportation policy that is either a cap and invest or a cap of some kind, or a performance standard of some kind, or a combination of them. And as Bram pointed out, that's a simple statement of, the facts of experience around the country and around the world. And so I do not take that statement to mean that this memo or the cross-sector committee is saying that a TCI type program is the only way to go. And I don't take it that this statement is precluding the carbon reduction strategy phase 2 from looking at a variety of possible solutions. But, and in fact, I don't even frankly understand why the administration representatives object to this statement, because as Bram pointed out, it's a pretty straightforward statement of the state of play on this topic around the country. And I think it's great that we're going to be looking at a range of alternatives, but I also think people need to be reminded that time is slipping past us here. And it is important for us, I think, as a council to send a message to the legislature and to other concerned stakeholders, to send a message that we need more than a collection of small measures. We need a framework to manage emissions from this sector that is in line with the Vermont law, and that framework requires more than kind of a miscellany of things we put in a shopping bag. So the cross-sector committee thought about this and decided to advance the memo with this language in it, and we frankly think it's unobjectionable language, but it does serve to remind stakeholders of how important having an overall framework is for the sector. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. Sue?
I thank Rich for explaining, because I have to admit to not having spent a lot of time and understanding these nuances. And I just want to offer the opportunity to put into the language that has been developed by the council folks, something that acknowledges and supports the agency's climate reduction strategies, while also noting that to date, the only policy options for which there is strong evidence, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it acknowledges that we are aware of and supportive of the work being undertaken by the agency and the state to explore all alternatives per federal, I guess, requirement. But we also recognize what's working elsewhere. I don't know, just a thought. I do have a totally separate thing that I wanted to raise, but I think it should come after we continue to discuss this point. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So thanks, Sue, and thanks, Jared, for your patience on this. And before I go, Jared, just one sec. I feel like what I've heard is a bunch of several of you supporting the inclusion of the sentence for the kind of reasons that Rich and others have been saying. And we've heard from Michelle and Secretary Moore about some concerns. And I just want to push it back for a second to the administration members to say, would something along the lines of what Sue said or some other modification of this be helpful at this point? Or would you simply like just to express a dissent on this point, right? Because I think we're kind of in decision-making mode at this point. So how would you like to express the way you're feeling about this?
Maybe, David, I'll jump in and just say, I think, sort of at its foundation, the issue is a belief from the administration that the carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed for Vermont to have a full understanding of what additional targeted or sector-wide pieces, policy pieces may be needed or effective. And without that sort of caveat on this recommendation, we could end up working on a policy piece without benefit of the analysis that's going on in the carbon reduction strategy. And I think this is just a push-pull between the sense of urgency that I think people appropriately feel and some of the very real steps the different administrative agencies are taking to try to improve the data and the foundation on which policy pieces would be built, regardless of whether it's a transportation policy or a thermal policy. And at some point, we have to have this reckoning with whether we continue to do this foundational research or launch forthwith into specific policy measures. And without that kind of caveat, and would defer to Michelle to weigh in here and make sure I'm adequately and accurately representing the current concerns of VTrans in addition to ANR. I just worry that we could go off in a direction here and lose the benefit of the really important work that VTrans has underway as part of this carbon reduction strategy.
And Secretary Moore, just as a very concrete idea moving forward, one way you all as a council can move forward is put in a specific mention in a footnote or some other way that says for the administration members of the council, say exactly what you just said. The carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed prior to making an assertion such as this, right? So that's one procedural thing that you could do today is you could drop a footnote in this document and we could say who has the concern and what that concern is. Is that something that would be interesting for you all as a pathway forward?
I guess my initial proposal might be to replace, I don't know what everybody else is seeing on their screen, but that sentence that starts in importantly is what's on my screen. And if there's a way to add in there specifically a recognition that the carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed in order to inform this work.
Okay. Okay. So Jared, let me put it back to you. That's a specific request from the administration about adding a sentence saying the strategy needs to be completed before making decisions on this. Jared, do you want to comment on that?
I just want to offer a few thoughts, partially in response to what Secretary Moore just said, but also following up on a couple of things that Michelle said earlier. I think one of the questions that was posed by Michelle, and if I don't get this language exactly right, I believe this was the intent, was this question of why should we make a kind of narrowing in specific recommendation with regard to policy in this memo before the carbon reduction strategy was done. And my thinking on this is that the climate action plan isn't a document for us. It is a public document that is the Climate Council is responsible for sharing with the Vermont public and with legislators about kind of where we stand in the process. And I do think that importantly, we know more now today than we did a year ago on December 1st, 2021, when the cap was first passed. So if you look at the language in the Climate Action Plan, it talks about a comparable program to the Transportation and Climate Initiative or other policies and programs broadly that could achieve similar results. What it did not speak specifically to is this additional information that we have found through the research of what other states, countries, and provinces have done, is to specifically hold up two types of strategies. And this is where I have to disagree with something that Michelle said. I believe you said, Michelle, that it seems to you that this presupposes a TCI type model. I disagree with that. I think that in many ways, what this recommendation does is open up additional possibilities that were not focused on in the first cap, including a performance standard focused on transportation fuels. That is a strategy that California, Oregon, and Washington State have used through their low carbon fuel standards or clean fuel standards. It is a strategy that other provinces and Canada are using. And I think importantly, when we talk about a cap and reduce, a cap and invest, other types of emissions capping policies, it also extends the option beyond just Transportation and Climate Initiative. There are programs like the Western.
Jared, I'm going to interrupt you for just 1 second. Sorry, to say, Secretary Moore had a specific suggestion about adding a sentence after the bolded sentence. What I heard Secretary Moore say was sort of, to be sure, any decision around a particular policy option should, I can't remember the exact words, but wait until there's a strategy in place. And just, if Secretary Moore, if you want to nod your head, if that's more or less what you were saying. Yeah, okay. So my question to you, Jared, how does that feel? Is that coherent with what you're trying to say about being clear about the state of play today?
I don't think so for three reasons. One is the one I just mentioned, which that sentence I think needs to stay in because it shares more information with the public and the legislature than we had last year. The second,
hang on, the sentence stays in. The sentence stays in. Well, the sentence stays in. The question is whether you add something afterwards.
Okay, so two reasons why I think that it would be problematic to add that sentence afterwards. One, it kind of negates the previous sentence. It says, we've identified that these may be two paths, but don't do any work on them until we do the carbon reduction strategy. I think that's problematic for two reasons. One is we have had a history in Vermont of forming commissions, forming councils, then doing studies which tell us an answer that people, for whatever reasons, are not willing to take. And so we're on this kind of, it's like a Groundhog Day type movie moment where we go in circles, having studies completed that tell us the same answer that we knew years ago. I would be amazed if the carbon reduction strategy comes up with any information that would contradict the sentence in question that is being opposed by the administration. And so I think we have a responsibility to say, no, we can't keep studying the same question and delaying action when we know what the answer is going to be. Yes, can we get more information on how to refine and design these broad policy types more specifically? Yes, and that is valuable. The other reason, and I just want to make sure that people, even though Joey highlighted the three main points or the kind of two action items and the one update in her slide, there's a whole paragraph that speaks to the carbon reduction plan and strategy and that research and lifting it up and saying, this is good that this is moving forward and that will be a next step. So and that speaks a little bit to what Sue was saying, in addition to what Secretary Moore was saying, there is already language in this memo that lifts that up and says that that is a process that we need to follow and continue to advance. The key thing is we can't keep, we could say ad infinitum, ad nauseum.
Okay,
wait
that's
for
fine.
research.
Yeah.
At some point, you need to call the question and act based on the best available information.
Super. That's helpful. Thanks, Jared, for clarifying that. Bram?
Yes, so I think the memo contains the estimate that advanced clean cars to and advanced clean trucks may get us something like 34% of the transportation reductions that are needed. I have had some brief conversations about the potential contribution that the carbon reduction strategy might provide, but the carbon reduction strategy, I believe, is limited to actions that can be effected within the Agency of Transportation's budget. And, you know, again, the conversation about how much that could possibly contribute, aren't huge numbers in terms of what AOT can do. It's, you know, not enough to get us there. It's going to be a meaningful component, but not sufficient to get us there. So yes, we need the carbon reduction strategy. Yes, Agency of Transportation's optimizing everything they do to reduce greenhouse gases is going to be a crucial component going forward. And it is also true that it does not appear at all mathematically likely that it will be adequate to get us to the reductions that are required by law without either cap and reduce or programmatic in those two broad areas. So saying, you know, adding a sentence that says we have to wait for a year before we make a decision doesn't make sense to me. I think, you know, we need to go full bore as fast as we can. And yes, we can stay open to new information and new options as they become available. If the work on the carbon reduction strategy does in fact uncover or develop a cost-effective way that will get us large reductions in emissions, absolutely, we can modify at that point. But in the meantime, there are only a couple paths that we know from the data that exists out there that will get us where we need to go, and we need to head down those paths.
Great. Okay. Super. June, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'm going to suggest a pathway forward, and we're taking some public comment, and then we'll, after that public comment, make some decisions, probably through some quick votes. June, go ahead, please.
I've listened very carefully to this discussion, and the impression I come away with is that there's material work being done with the CRS, two agencies with noted expertise paid for by Vermont taxpayers are counseling that we take a more measured approach. All I've heard of here is a rush to judgment without taking the time to complete a study that may well bear out what people want to decide today, but that as of today is not in fact reflected in what we know. And from years and years of either superintending proceedings or advocating in proceedings where people would have loved to rush to judgment to get a PUC order, I simply cannot countenance this kind of decision-making. We need to be disciplined in our approach to these matters, especially where cost effectiveness is at issue. And I don't feel that we are there, and therefore would highly recommend, at a minimum, that the council consider the proposal Secretary Moore has put forward. But I am not at all comfortable with the rush to judgment. I have heard nothing that tells me that we have actually evaluated whether these strategies can work in Vermont specifically. And it is pointless to me to participate in promulgating an amendment to a plan without that kind of knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So this is what I recommend, given that in the comments we're hearing. I think we should hear some public comment. And when we come back from the public comment, we should make some decisions. And I'm going to propose 3 things that we do some quick votes on. One is the memo is currently written. Test how that does. 2 is a version with the line that Secretary Moore suggests and test how that does. And the 3rd is as currently written and with the line that Secretary Moore says, but as a footnote that specifically says who views that, whether it's administration members or other members. And so it would be a clear sort of showing of the area of concern that's being put forward by members of the administration. I think we should do those 3 quick votes when we get back from public comment as a way of understanding really where you all stand as a council. And from those votes, choose the one that garners the most support, and that will be your decision around this memo. So if that seems agreeable to folks, let's take some public comment, probably take a quick break and come back and we'll do those quick votes in order to make a decision on this. So Annette, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I have 3 questions. I would like someone to please give the elevator speech to explain to the average Vermonter what is a cap and invest, cap and reduce policy covering transportation fuels. What does that mean for the average Vermonter? What is a performance standard, performance-based regulatory approach covering transportation fuels? What does that mean? What does that, how does that come into play in the real world? And my 3rd question is, will adopting this language, is there an agenda to bring forward in this upcoming legislative session something related to this, like a low carbon fuel standard? Does this open the door to actually implementing some of whatever these things mean? So those are my comments and questions, and I would appreciate an explanation for the average Vermonter of what these policies are that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. Are there other folks who have been observing our conversation today that would like to make a comment? Okay. I'm not seeing additional comment. I am tempted, unless people would like a break, I am tempted to just pick, see if we can finish this off right now. So unless someone wants to shout out and be like, yes, please, I really want a break right now. I don't want to vote on this thing. Please shout out right now. I'm happy to go to break. Otherwise, I'd rather take your temperature right now and see where we stand on the memo. So let me just pause. Anybody would prefer to take a 15-minute break right now or 10-minute break? Secretary Clauser?
Sorry, unrelated to the break, and I guess assuming we're not taking one, I just have a comment on votes. So maybe we should wait for a break decision before I make that comment.
Sure, just quick. Anybody want a break? Just real easy. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. Let's keep going. Yep.
So I just wonder what the 3rd vote adds, in that I think it kind of assumes that the administration is the only members with that concern or comments, and I think it takes away from the sentence if in fact it is added with a footnote saying like, don't worry about it, it's just the administration members. So I just want to, I think the first 2 make sense, right, as is, and Julie's comment, and then folks can, or Julie's addition, folks can feel free to weigh in accordingly. I don't see what that 3rd alternative adds.
Okay, that's fine. Yep. Okay, and if folks are uninterested in the 3rd, that's fine too. Okay. Let's test though the first 2, the memo as is and the memo with the suggested amendment. And Leslie Ann, I just saw your hand come up.
Yeah, I just wanted to just chime in, David, before we move forward. I think it might be helpful for the public record to actually have a one sentence response to the questions that Annette raised, just for clarity, so that we don't lose those as part of the entire discussion. So just maybe a one sentence answer. Thanks.
That's great. So if someone is able to answer Annette's questions concisely right now, that's a great thing to do. I was hoping to do it a little bit later, but I think let's do it right now if that feels like right. So I'll ask folks who are closest in on those policies, what it means from a sort of layman's terms to do those two types of policies that were just that are referenced in the memo. If anybody wants to take a whack at that. Jared, you want to do the 30-second version of that?
I'm happy to give one version. What both an emissions cap policy and a performance standard policy on transportation fuels do is they place requirements on fossil fuel importers to reduce pollution over time. So they have the same end goal, but there's different ways in which that is accomplished. In a cap, usually allowances are provided, an allowance to pollute. And those allowances are auctioned off with the revenues coming to the state or the jurisdiction to reinvest in further emissions reduction activities. Performance standard is the reverse. Instead of getting an allowance to pollute, you have to undertake activities that reduce pollution for which you get credit. Either way, the activities of the obligated fossil fuel importers have to come in under a cap or add up to an amount of pollution reduction. So they both work backwards from requirements. They just approach it from different directions. The bottom line is that these policies place responsibility on fossil fuel importers, where the vast majority of our climate pollution comes from, and provide certainty and clarity to those actors and to the energy markets over time.
Nice. Thanks, Jared. That's great. Great. And if anyone wants to add to that, Joey, you want to add to that quickly?
Well, just that maybe the elevator pitch on the two pathways, cap and invest and performance standard. But in terms of, answering or trying to address Annette's question related to, do we anticipate action in the legislature? I don't know. I am not a lawmaker, but my instinct would say probably not. We have a new incoming sort of significant overhaul of the legislature and some likely big priorities, including a couple or many more of ours, which are included in the climate action plan, both in the mitigation, adaptation, and resilience space, I hope. So my gut, and again, I don't want to presuppose the legislative outcome, is it's not likely to, they're not likely to lift one or both of these things. I could be proven mistaken, but that is why I think that it aligns well with the information we will get from the carbon reduction strategy. If that's going to be delivered in November next year, then that information would inform the next legislative session. I would also just remind us that as the climate action plan is written, and I think this is important with the results of the recent elections sugaring out, we're not the only state with pollution reduction mandates. And there are new folks taking the reins in other states. We had recommended, resurrecting TCIP if other states can, pushed. So that's still an open question to me, and it's still a recommendation in the climate action plan that we could and should potentially pursue if momentum moves in that direction.
Thanks, Joey. Megan, go ahead and introduce yourself as well, if not everybody knows you.
Sure. Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. My name is Megan O'Toole. I'm the Climate Change Program Mitigation Program Manager at the Climate Action Office at ANR. And I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on Jared's talking points related to answering Annette's questions, and wanted to highlight 2 examples of a performance standard program that we currently implement in Vermont. One is the Advanced Clean Cars program, which we're currently seeking to amend in the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program, which is a technology standard program where automakers are required to manufacture cleaner vehicles and more electric vehicles and deliver them for sale to Vermont. And then also our renewable energy standard program is another example. So I just wanted to highlight those as 2 examples of those programs that we currently implement in the state of Vermont, because I think it's helpful to have, real programmatic examples to tie these policy decision-making conversations to. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Sue, last word on this, and then let's figure out where we stand.
I would just like to understand whether the CRS, the carbon reduction strategies being undertaken, include the cap and invest approach or performance standard approach. So is this discussion incorporated, or is it somehow not?
Yes, the CRS will include looking at both of those as well as any other types of policies separately and in coordination with each other.
And just to confirm, I think I heard that this is the timeline for the CRS is this year. Is that correct?
That is correct. We expect to have the first draft in August of 2023, and we actually have to submit the final draft to Federal Highway Administration November 15th of 2023. So it'd be mid-fall when it's finalized next year.
And every state is doing the same?
That is correct.
And everyone may include cap and invest type strategies?
They may.
Or is that a state decision that we
It's a
would
state
make?
decision, right? It's a state decision.
And is it anywhere written that ours will, or is that just something that you have included in your scope?
It's included in the scope that the consultant undertake the analysis of what the GHG reduction impact would be, to include those types of policies, the cap and invest, performance standard, and other types of policies such as the clean cars, clean trucks, et cetera. So it's kind of similar to what the TCI did in looking at a suite of activities relative specifically to the transportation sector, and what singularly or in combination with each other these different approaches will get us, and what the impacts from an equity, economic, et cetera, basis will be as a result of choosing a particular pathway.
Thank you.
Okay. So to simplify our decision, let me just suggest 2 things that are going to happen. 2 quick votes. One vote is the memo as it stands right now, its current language, and adopting that as an amendment, as an addendum to the current cap. And so this just gets added to the current cap as a memo that you as a council approach. The second vote we'll do is an amended version of that memo that includes the sentence that Secretary Moore put in, and test that and how that lands with you all as a council. Yeah, sorry.
Can somebody just hammer out real quick the two different versions we're voting on and sharing the screen?
Yeah, I don't have a Microsoft Word version of the memo, but what I do have is the one sentence that would be added to it, and it's this one sentence, and it would be added. It would be added immediately after that bolded sentence. I can put that up on the screen in just a second. It would be added as this sentence right after that bolded sentence. Nothing would be removed. It would just be adding a sentence in. Does that work, Chris? So my idea would be, let's have these 2 quick votes, and whichever one garners more support amongst you all as counselors. And June, yeah. So my suggestion here is that this memo becomes an addendum to the cap. And if folks have questions about it, let's talk about that right now before we do these votes. If that's not clear, or if folks have concerns of what that means to put in an addendum to the cap.
Yeah, so I just want to be clear, David, that I'm bringing forward Bram's concern about process. That's all.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it sounds to me like we're talking about voting on amending the cap, and he was asking very clearly, what does that look like? What does that mean? I don't have an answer for that.
So let me suggest something, and then let's talk about that for 1 second, which is literally sort of pasting this on to the cap as an addendum. It's not modifying or changing language in the cap. It's pasting this on as an addendum. And I would welcome folks to chime in on that if that makes sense or doesn't make sense to folks. But it's essentially saying, here's something that we're adding on after years of additional work. Kelly?
I have another procedural question, quick one, which is, are we considering that people could vote for both if they're happy?
Yeah,
with both?
absolutely.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure it didn't have to be an either or necessarily.
No, we're trying to test which version, whether the amended version or the original version has more support. Sue?
Just clarifying, the version with Julie's amendment does not eliminate the language in question as the proposal that they presented to us did. It actually just adds that sentence. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct. So yeah, and so I would call these straw votes. We're going to test, and then I would suggest you all make a decision after we've done those 2 straw votes to take the action that got the most support. Okay. Joey?
I just wanted, in terms of what Secretary Moore, the sentence she's recommending, is it the CRS needs to be completed to have a full understanding of additional will be effective or needed to achieve the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act? Can we add that at the end?
Sorry, this is help me out here. So is he?
I'm gonna add a.
She's not even here. Oh no. Can you say that one more time, Joey? What is exactly?
Or needed to achieve the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Oh yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay. In the absence of Secretary Moore on that, just let me quickly check with Michelle. Do you think that accurately reflects the kinds of concerns you've talked about inside the administration if you added just to achieve the requirements of the GWSA?
Well, I don't want to make the linkage that we will, even if we have the outcomes and we have direction on sort of where to go with policy, I don't know that we will achieve the requirements of the GWSA. You know what I'm saying? It's like these may take us in the direction of achieving the requirements, but I can't say for certain without knowing the outcomes as to whether they will achieve the requirements. That's my only caveat that I'm a little concerned about.
Can I just quick response? I can appreciate that, Michelle, and I just think it's important to, tie us back to what we're trying to do, so aimed at achieving the requirements of GWSA.
So, yeah, I agree. We will put a sentence in. What we're trying to do here is I'm going to defer to Secretary Moore as well, because this was your sentence to make you and the administration feel comfortable. So can you say what would make you and the administration feel comfortable with a sentence in this?
I have to be honest that I just ran out to deal with my plumber for the last 10 minutes. But the sentence I had put in was one that said, that recognized the carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed for Vermont to have a full understanding of what additional targeted or sector-wide policy pieces will be effective or needed. And to me, there are a couple of key points in there. Obviously, one's the order of operations piece. The other is Vermont specific. I'm worried that things like TCI that looked good at a regional level may not work for Vermont. I think we were slated to benefit disproportionately from some of the regional investments that wouldn't fall here necessarily if Vermont worked unilaterally. And so I do think having that carbon reduction strategy completed first and recognizing it'll be more specific to Vermont are both important tenets of any amendment.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest for simplicity's sake that we take the language exactly as Secretary Moore said as option 2. So we're voting on 2 things, and Erica, go ahead and then I'll clarify exactly what we're voting on with the exact language.
Yeah, so my question is a voting question. I feel like the straw vote is assuming that we support this going into the cap as an addendum in the first place. And I just wonder if there's going to be an opportunity to vote on yay or nay.
And as opposed to some other pathway that this memo takes that's not an addendum to the cap?
Opposed to some other, revised version of the memo. I guess I have a concern about the fact that this says the same thing as in the cap. So I'm not, they made a good point about the role of addenda in the cap, and I'm not really sure what we're spending a lot of time here to achieve when the cap says this more or less. And so that's my concern, is that I'm not sure that I personally support even a revised version. I think the subcommittee did a lot of good work here, but I'm not there yet.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to test, though, to see if adding this document as an addendum to the cap, sort of a supplemental piece of the cap, right? Officially, you all as the council adding it. Let's test and see if there's support for that. And then I want to test if there's more or less support for a version with the sentence that Secretary Moore suggested would address their concerns. And I recognize some folks may feel like it's not such a big deal to add this to the addendum and they'd prefer they not, but let's test exactly those 2 things about taking this memo as written and adding it as an addendum to the cap. That'll be the first thing we'll test with a quick straw vote. And then the second straw vote is we will test a revised version of this memo that only does one thing. It adds a sentence, and it'll add exactly the sentence as Secretary Moore said. And I'm putting it again in the chat. It's adding that sentence. And that's the second vote we'll do, is a revised version of this memo, which adds that one sentence in immediately after that text in bold that I had shown on the screen previously, which I can show again quickly and add it. If this is the sentence that's been causing the consternation, it would add that sentence right here before this, importantly. Okay, so those are the 2 straw votes we're going to do. And I would suggest at the end of those straw votes that you all as a council then agree to move forward with whichever had the most support amongst you. Okay, so let's do this. If you can have your camera on, if you're a member of the Climate Council, or you can use the reactions tab. And we'll just literally hold hands up and do a quick count over the Zoom here. All right, so let's, again, we're going to do 2 votes. The first one is the memo as written and as online. And the second one is adding that one phrase that I just put into the chat and not eliminating anything. Okay, so let's do the first one first. You all as a council members, do you support taking this memo as written and putting it as an addendum to the initial climate action plan? And go ahead and raise your hands. We'll do a quick count of hands if you support that. Okay, so I'm going to need Marion and others to help me count, because keep your hands up. Don't drop it. Don't drop it. I'm taking a quick screenshot as well to have some evidence. Okay, so I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, I hope that's the same count as Marion had.
That's what we had.
Okay, 11. Great. You can put your hands down. Thanks so much, everybody. Now, for the second vote we're going to take, And Rich, you can take down the reactions tab. Perfect. So the second vote we're going to do is about the revised version that adds that one sentence that I added in the chat. No deletions, just adding a one sentence. And this is the revised version. So let's do this one more time. Are you, as a counselor, comfortable with this revised version becoming an addendum to the initial climate action plan? All right, so you can vote in both times. This wasn't an either or. Are you comfortable with this revised version becoming an addendum to the initial climate action plan? Adding that addendum. Go ahead and raise your hands if you're comfortable with the revised version. Okay, so I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Help me out. Just keep your hands up, folks, please. Thank you. We're doing this on Zoom. Just keep your hands right up while you're doing this. Okay, I count 10. Marion, how about you?
Yes, 10.
Okay.
Count me in too. I'm good either way. In the end, we're okay.
And that gets us
Okay.
to 11.
So with Chris, that's 11 and 11.
And
Okay.
just to be clear, neither one has a majority then.
Neither one is a majority of the council. That's fascinating. Although majority is a majority of those who are present,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Okay.
Hey,
Well, we did a straw vote. It sounds like you're pretty split on this. And there's a number of you who cross over and so you feel comfortable on both. Sounds like you might want to do a quick rewrite that makes you feel comfortable and we can all live with this. Liz, Joey, Chris, Virginia, and then we got to take a break too. Liz?
I'm fine. You can, I'll take
Okay.
my hand down. I'm fine
Joey?
now.
I mean, I guess I just process-wise, just Secretary Moore was out dealing with plumbing issues. I can relate, so I appreciate you had to step out for a moment. But I know that it feels implied that it would be tied back to achieving the Global Warming Solutions Act, but maybe important to be explicit about aiming to achieve the Global Warming Solutions Act at the end of that sentence.
So again, this is trying to find one more pathway forward that might create a more robust level of support in the council. Secretary Moore, it was to yours. Back to you saying if you could add to the end of your phrase some specific reference to the GWSA goals. Hang on, you're on mute.
Yep, I'm just trying to put that all together in my head. Let's see.
So this is the kind of situation where honestly, it may benefit us to take a quick break and just consider how we may address this seeming indecision we all have here with the exact 11-11 split on your preference. Joey, thank you for offering a pathway forward. And Secretary Moore, it'd be interesting for you to think about that for a second.
Can I just clarify what's being proposed? It's to end essentially what policy pieces will be effective or needed to achieve the goals of the global or the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Mm-hmm. End that sentence with that kind of phrase, yeah.
All right, let me sit with that for a minute.
Okay. And I recognize we're gonna lose some folks at the top of the hour. We also have a number of other things. Secretary Moore, is that the kind of thing that would be helpful for you to have 10 minutes to sit with and come back?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So why don't we do that? Why don't we take 10 minutes? We'll come back. Why don't we come back at 1:10? And we may have a solution forward, depending on how Secretary Moore's thinking evolves on this. And that may allow you all to stand behind something more clearly. Let's do that. We'll see you back here at 1:10. And we'll finalize this and move on to the other pieces that we know we have to do today as well. Okay, so why don't we do that? We'll see you back here at 1:10. And I'm happy to talk with anyone if you want to give me a quick call on my cell and walk through potential pathways for resolving this. We'll see you back. Okay, so if you're here, can you pop your camera back on? And we'll get going. Okay. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. And Secretary Moore was going to take a moment to ponder a suggestion from Joey about how to really draw this back into the GWSA. And thanks, Abby. And I have a version, I have that sentence here on my screen, and if you're okay, Secretary Moore, I can drop it in, or if you have it.
Yep, I've just muted myself. I dropped it into the chat and hopefully posted it, but maybe I muted myself.
I think you need to hit send. There it goes.
All right,
Okay.
there it goes.
Okay, so where we left off was because we had a very even split about the memo as written and the memo with this additional phrase in it. There was a suggestion, could we modify this phrase to tie back to the GWSA? And that may spur some, not all, but some of you to feel more enthusiastic about this phrase. And so Secretary Moore, I see in the chat here, the phrase does tie it back to the GWSA now. So it reads, and I'll read it aloud if anybody can't see the chat for some reason. It says, the CRS needs to be completed for Vermont to have a full understanding of what additional targeted or sector-wide policy pieces are cost-effective and or needed to achieve the requirements of the GWSA. Okay, so that does do, I think, Joey, what you were suggesting needed to happen. And so let me just, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of discussion about it. I know, Jared, you've put in the chat just before we went to a break, you're concerned you don't like adding a sentence at all. I think for the interest of time, let's say it's this sentence or nothing at this point. We've done a couple rounds on this now. Jared, do you want to make a quick comment on that?
Yeah, the thing I want to bring up is not what I put in the chat. It's really a factual statement. The way that the revised sentence is and what Secretary Moore put in the chat, I don't believe is factually accurate. We already know that we are not on track to meet the emissions reduction requirements. This sentence makes it sound as though the carbon reduction strategy needs to be completed to see if there is a remaining gap. When we assess the existing policies and programs, advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks gets us 14% of the overall need. That's the projection in a best case scenario, 14% of the overall needed reductions economy-wide, maybe a third of what we need in the transportation sector. We already know that there is a significant gap that needs to be filled. I think the carbon reduction strategy can give us additional information, but it's not going to tell us what we don't already know and that there is a gap to be filled. That is another problem I have with this sentence.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jared. Rich?
Well, I'll agree with what Jared just said, and also make the point that if this sentence is added, that I think we should be clear that we are not asking the legislature to wait another year before they start discussing and learning about the policy options that are going to have to be confronted with or without the CRS. And so that I just want the record to be clear here that we're not asking if we were to adopt this sentence, we would not be asking the legislature to wait a year before they even start talking about the policy options that we might need.
Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. Right. So just to be clear, if you have this sentence in there, is the intent, like, let me just be clear, for those who think this is an important sentence to have in there, is the intent to pause the legislative discussion of this, or is the intent to allow that to continue as you go forward here?
I would offer, my intent is to make sure the legislature is aware that there is additional important work being done in this space that can inform these conversations. Or can and should inform these conversations.
Okay.
I agree with what Julie just said. And I think Rich's point is well taken.
Okay. Okay, well, I think let's test how this is landing and see if we do better than our 11-11 split last time. And I do want to emphasize as well, I thought in Erica's point earlier, that you all have not had a conversation yet about the mechanics of creating an addendum to the cap. You have not talked about sort of the implications of doing that. And so if folks are feeling uncomfortable, as Erica is, that seems like a conversation you need to have in your December meeting, right? So you all can make a decision about which version of this memo you like, and still have that conversation in December about what does it mean to amend to make an addendum to the cap? What do we have in terms of, you know, our sort of overall process going forward about that? So I want to highlight that these can be two separate things where you are accepting the content of what you want to transmit as a council, and you still have some procedural things to talk about on the sort of nuts and bolts of what it means to make an addendum to your initial climate action plan and the responsibilities you might have around public engagement and other things around that. And I'm not sure that's, Erica, exactly where you're going, but it felt like I was hearing some queasiness that you haven't really discussed the sort of the mechanics or the policy you want to adopt around amending or creating addendums to the cap. Is that true, Erica? Is that where you're going with that? Yeah.
I have lots of issues with this, so.
Right.
So that's a big piece.
Right. So why don't we set an agenda item for our December meeting about specifically that, and today make a decision about the content of this memo that would be used to then do whatever amending procedure you agree on in December, if that makes sense to folks. So we are looking at the content of this and recognizing there's still some work to do around the actual mechanics of making an addendum to your initial climate action plan. Okay. I want to do a quick straw vote on how people are reacting to this new sentence that would be added in to this memo, potentially, and see if it does better than the last two votes that we had. And so again, Leslie Ann, I just saw your hand come up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a point of clarification just before we did another vote. Just making sure, just checking for myself, that both of the things that we're talking about here, the ongoing work that's taking place at VTrans, the pieces that we're trying to make sure we're not losing sight of, that they're able to proceed on parallel tracks together, and it's not an either or a one supersedes the other. Because if I think back to, you know, like what goes on in academia, things go on at the same time all the time. And so I just wanted to sort of raise that so that we don't lose sight of the fact that we could all be coming to a very, very good place at the end, but everybody could feel okay with all of these various pieces that are still moving forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Leslie Ann. Okay. Great. And I think in that spirit, let's just quick test how this new version of a potential amendment to this memo would stand. I'm going to throw it in the chat one more time. It's Julie put it in, Secretary Moore put it in there. That's the sentence that would you potentially could add to this memo. And let's see if it does better than the previous two things we tried, which was the original memo and a slightly different version of that sentence. So let's quick check if that memo with this sentence added in feels like the appropriate content that you all want to be expressing as a council as you're figuring out how to amend the cap. So let's do a quick straw vote that yes, you as a counselor can live with this sentence being added into the memo, complementing the additional text, the text that is already in there. So let's do the quick voting with the hands one more time. This sentence being added into the memo as the output from this process. So hands raised up. Secretary Moore, is that a yes for you or not? Yes. Yes? Okay, so keep your hands up because we got to actually count votes here. This is a little tricky.
And David, this one seems different because you're not saying whether we could be okay with both. So I'm sorry, you've lost me. I am
pause,
as I was
quick
before.
pause.
I'm fine with either version, but advance the ball this way. So
Okay, can we quick pause then if anybody's confused? Because that's not fair if folks are feeling confused. So a quick pause. We just did 2 straw votes before, right? A bunch of folks said they're okay with the original memo. The same number of folks, different folks said they're okay with a sentence being added into that memo to address the concerns. Now we're doing a third vote, which is to say, here's a slightly changed version that we are hopeful might garner a little bit more support. And that's what we're doing, Liz, is we're just testing whether this sentence you feel
and
comfortable.
you're having us re-vote. So like I said
Yep.
yes before, I say yes again. So you're really just seeing if you're picking up additional people, which
Correct. That's exactly what we're
so
doing.
but some of us will be changing our prior vote based on 3 additional words, but okay.
Okay, but this is for this one. Okay. And Joey, do you have a quick question?
Well, I guess originally when we had the first vote, I thought I counted 12 counselors supporting the original memo, not 11. I don't know if that's a distinction with.
I took a picture, so I'm
Okay.
happy to share my pictures in the thing if I can figure out how to do that. I didn't count
Okay.
that. Wow, that's frustrating. It's so close. Okay, yes, let's move on. Let's take this vote and let's see where we stand and see if we pick up more folks. All right, so let's see if this is a better option. We're adding this, we're testing your willingness to add this additional phrase into the memo and use that as your expression as the council and your views on transportation and how you want to see that going forward. All right, so let's do that vote one more time. Adding this revised sentence in. If you could just raise your hands quickly, if you're okay with adding this revised sentence in and having this memo now revised, go forward. All right, so we just do a quick count. If you raise your hands with the revised sentence, okay. So I'm counting 1, 2, 3. Keep your hands up if you don't mind, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm counting 8. Does somebody else count differently? I'm taking a picture. Marion, asking for your help here.
It's 7. Virginia's not a counselor, so.
Yeah, I'm not counting Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah, I have 8.
Yeah, okay. You can put your hands down. Okay. Wow. That's a little of a tricky moment you guys have gotten yourself into. It feels like we need to put a pause button on this and come back in December and figure this out, because honestly, you're fairly divided on how you want to move forward. And this doesn't seem to be a great venue for finding a solution to it.
Whoa.
Hello?
Well, can't we just vote and dispose of this? I mean,
Sure.
or are we going to try to find 100% consensus? What is going on?
Okay.
Sorry, I raised my hand, but what's going on?
Trying to find a version in which you all are able to express sort of a large number of folks here. And if we're not finding that version, we can do a straight up vote back on the original version. If folks want to do that, I'm happy to do that. But we're trying to find one that reaches a number of you and feels like expresses how you feel about this. Bram?
You know, I wonder if there is a statement that will acknowledge the point raised by Secretary Moore and others that there is ongoing work and that some of the work that emerges in the CRS may enhance the cap. And that suggests that we acknowledge that and urge the administration and the legislature and ourselves to incorporate any of the analysis or recommendations from the CRS that enhance the cap's ability to meet its goals. And, you know, I have a possible suggested language that I wrote up. So I'm just going to hit enter and there it is in the chat. And it may just make everything worse, but it may help us articulate what it is we are all trying to achieve.
Thanks, Bram. Thanks for suggesting something. Leslie Ann?
Well, Bram did much more eloquently than I was going to. I was going to actually suggest that third way so that everybody feels honored and appreciated in all of the materials and concerns that have been brought forward. And so I think there was a little bit of support in the chat going on for the notion that things could proceed together. And so I think Bram did a really good job in trying to meld that in a way that hopefully lifts up that ability to have a lot of work proceed in the same space.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie Ann. Lauren?
Well, I raised my hand before Chris kind of jumped in, but I'll just kind of share in his frustration. I'd prefer that we can move on and talk about the budget, which I think has more opportunity really for the state. That said, I did also count 12, as Joey noted, and I think that that makes a majority of the council, and therefore, based on our roadmap, we should be able to move forward with that and recommend that instead of continuing to try to hammer this out, you know, 3 words at a time, like Liz said, let's just go back to the front and say we had one that had the most votes. Do we still have that same number of votes? If that is the highest majority, we should move forward with that and talk budget. That's my recommendation.
Okay. Great. Yeah. And I apologize that the mechanics of this are a little bit off, that it's difficult for us to do that. And I'm happy to throw, if I can figure out how to upload this document into the chat of the.
It's
of the
difficult to
screenshot.
go back to the original language as drafted by the subcommittee or the task group.
Right. Yeah, we could do that and see if that's that could, if we can get a majority of those present. Yeah.
I need to register my concerns here. We have a process and David is in charge of that process. Secretary Clauser chairs these meetings. It isn't for individual council members to suddenly weigh in and tell us what they counted. That line was drawn and David is saying he has documentation. That needs to be how we govern ourselves here.
Respectfully, we govern ourselves by the draft roadmap that we all agreed to.
That does
in
not
late
say
2020
individual
or early
councilors
2021.
weigh in and upend votes.
No, it says that we
go
can
through a
go by
process
majority
and
when
that
we
there is
can't
a
reach
chair for this
consensus.
meeting and that there is a process for it and this is not being followed.
And when consensus can't be met, we go to majority, as I read it. I could be wrong, David.
We did not have a
the
consensus in
concern-
the first vote.
Right. The concern I have is just the mechanics of way we did the straw votes and making sure we didn't miss any votes and we did an appropriate count. And so the good news is I have a photo, and I'm happy to share that photo on my screen, and we can all look at it and see what we see. And if we do have a majority, I'm happy to go back and use that as a pathway to move on. You all clearly have some divided views on this, and sadly it's down to a majority vote. So everybody can take a look at this and see what they see.
I just have a point of clarification. Is there a picture of the second page in case there were any counselors who weren't on page 1 of the Zoom screen?
No, but I am quite confident that there weren't any counselors on the second page. But if I am doing this counting now,
That I'm counting 13 hands. Assuming Gina's hand is cut off here.
but Gina's
on
not
my
a member of
screen.
the council.
I'm not
Oh,
on the.
thank you. All right, so that would be 12.
I also count 12. So when
In that
compared
case,
to
David, I apologize to the group.
Mhm. So I think the mechanics of the way we did our straw vote became pretty important given how tight those views were. And I'm glad that folks helped to make sure that we were being clear about exactly the outcomes. And so as a matter of procedure, and given how convoluted this has been, I apologize for that. Why don't we do one more? And since we use majority vote as our backup, we can try one more time and see if we have a majority to pass forward what's being put. And I appreciate Bram's effort. And that can be some language that individual counselors want to express as well. But as a matter of moving on, why don't we do a quick vote about adopting the memo as written and see if that garners, again, those 12 votes, which would be probably a majority of who's here, right? And those are our official rules, is we strive for consensus. If we're struggling in a procedural thing like this, we can do a majority vote. Okay, so let's do it one more time, just because of the concerns about how this all happened. Secretary Clauser.
So prior to voting again, I just want to be crystal clear with everyone to make sure I understand what we're voting on, which is substance of the memo, separate and apart from the question as to how and what process and procedure is involved in amending the cap.
I have heard in today's conversation an interest in diving into that more, and that seems like something to do in your next meeting.
I just wanted to be clear since
To be
we're
very
voting
clear
again,
about
substance
how
of
you,
the memo.
yeah, that's what we're doing here.
Thanks.
Okay. Great. So why don't we do this as a final vote and see if we have a majority. And I just want to confirm with Marion and Jane, who are there, what is our total number of counselors that are present right now, so that we know those numbers going in. I count 16. 17.
17 is what I counted. Wait, and maybe what we could ask right now is like Gina, anyone who's not a counselor, just to go off screen. And let's just have counselors on screen. Even Mary and I will go off. Just have counselors lift it up. I think going forward, this is identifying that we need a different process for voting.
Yeah, this is not a great thing. Yep.
But for today, let's all have counselors on the screen and everyone else off.
And I will actually say, let's use the chat to do the vote so that we can actually have a chat record of it as well. Okay, and then we can count from the chat. So the specific motion being put forward for a vote is the memo as the content of the council's recommendations around transportation going forward. And so if you are comfortable with that memo as an expression of the council, could you please in the chat say yes? And if you're not comfortable, say no. The key thing are the yeses. Could I make sure everybody's going in the chat with their yes? If you have it, or a no? Okay. So I welcome everybody to help fact check on exactly how many are in there, but it appears to be more than a majority of those present. So if we have got 17 present, you'd need 9. My math work is okay, and I'm counting at least that. But I welcome everyone to double check that to make sure we're on the same page there. Okay, so let's treat that as our final piece on that. And thanks everyone for putting up with a little bit of clunky mechanism there.
David, do you want to state for the record what the final vote was? I don't know if we heard that.
So I'm going through and I'm very cautious about doing this correctly, but what I count, because there's some that are like fine with me, so I want to make sure I'm really counting it right, and there's some shores and things like that. So I'm just doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I count 11, and I welcome anyone to double check that count. 11 out of the 17 present.
11 yes and 6 no's is what you get.
I didn't count the no's, I just counted the yeses.
5 no's with 1 abstaining. With 1 abstaining, yeah.
Okay, so for the record, we've got 11 yeses, 5 no's, and 1 abstention. Okay. Thanks everyone for that clunky, for putting up with that clunkiness. I apologize, we've really eaten into our time for the other items today. I think what we need to do is to touch on them and make sure we have a plan for them. We won't be able to solve these, but certainly if we want to quickly dive into the prioritization piece and have a plan that makes sense for all of you for the coming weeks and how you want to address this request from the Joint Fiscal Office. I know, Jane, you had a slide put together to quickly just summarize what came in from the Joint Fiscal Office as a response to the memo that was put together with your budget recommendations. I believe it's online as well, if folks want to look for it online. Okay. Jane, do you want to say anything about this?
Sure, happy to. One, I also just feel want to acknowledge that the biomass conversation too for folks, we've had folks present from that task group ready to comment on that today too. So I just want to highlight that there are additional members here who were here to give you all an update on that. So I just want to be respectful of their time too. But quickly, I will say that this, when I submitted the memo on your behalf to Joint Fiscal, well, I should say to the governor's office, the administration, as well as chairs of the relevant committees in the legislature and other senators and representatives of jurisdiction. I pretty quickly was corresponded with the Joint Fiscal Office in response to comments that they heard from the legislature around the need for further prioritization to inform decision-making at the legislature this year around one-time funding and budget requests. So they had a very specific ask of how they'd like things to be prioritized. And they asked specifically about giving deference to budget recommendations that pave the path for further work down the road. And then asked around putting those items, all of those items, specifically in a table that speaks to the what, why, how, outcome, investment, and when, so that they could make a decision and be informed when the governor presents his budget in response to the recommendations that you asked for. So the steering committee asked to bring this to the full council, and I'll ask that others there provide any clarity around what was being asked specifically of the council with this request.
Thanks, Jane. In the steering committee, you all spoke about a couple of options, right? You spoke about an option of pushing these back to the the subcommittees, and having the subcommittees do as much or as little of this as they choose to do in this response. You also spoke about a possibility of maybe co-chairs of the subcommittees coming together and trying to do this together quickly. So those are the kinds of things, procedure-wise, you could choose to do as you respond to this request. Any quick thoughts from folks about the right pathway for you all to respond to this? In the coming weeks, and what you'd like to see happen? Jared?
Just want to offer an additional option, which when we discussed kind of the appropriate way to respond in the timeline, I don't think I had fully in my mind the importance of and how quickly the January deadline of a report from the council was coming up. And I think this may be a situation in which, with a limited timeline and limited resources, we need to consider prioritizing. So I just wonder about another option that we may consider, which is, we did our best to prioritize with the process, timeline, and information we had at hand. And I worry that if we go back into a prioritization conversation across all the subcommittees, or even from the co-chairs or steering committee, over the next weeks, it will make it very difficult for us to do what I think is a more important and greater responsibility, which is the report to the legislature on all of our work, the climate action plan as it stands, what has moved forward, what has not moved forward, the existing gap. So that's another option I want to put on the table, is we respectfully say that we work to put in prioritization, but that we don't feel that, given other obligations from the legislature, notably an annual report to the legislature by January, we have the time or ability to do further prioritization. I haven't fully thought through the pros and cons of that, but I think it's another option that should be on the table.
Right. It is not your obligation to respond to this, right? It is whether you choose to respond to this and make that a priority for your work in the coming weeks or not, right? Okay. I'm curious, other folks, do folks have a strong preference of how this work gets done or doesn't get done? Thoughts about that? Kelly?
Thinking about Jared's comment and this request, I feel like the fact that we are being asked for further prioritization it's nice to be asked. It's really, I like the respect it shows for the fact that we put a lot of time and thought into this. I also have no real sense of what lift it would take to come up with that prioritization. I certainly don't have the expertise to do that. So I weigh that in the balance also. But I think the fact that we're being asked to do this is something that I wouldn't throw away lightly.
Thanks, Kelly. Chris?
Yeah, I was gonna basically say, I mean, to my mind, this is gonna take that prioritization process would probably take a level of effort I'm not sure the council has the capacity to do. That's not up to me to decide. That's up to all the counselors to figure that out. The other thing I'll just note is, one of the things we discussed at the steering committee meeting, and I'm not trying to get ahead of my skis or anybody else, but hell, this may be my last meeting with you guys. I don't know what's going to happen. But anyway, one of the things that the conversation is going to have to be had is, given the proposal on, A&R staffing, how, exactly what the council is going to need to continue operation and what kind of level of support it's going to need, both for the council itself and all the subcommittees. We're going to need to be a conversation about just kind of a preview for the councilors, if you want to go back and look at the steering committee meeting, about kind of the council coming into like its own and figuring out exactly how it's going to be able to support itself. And to my mind, this conversation about budget prioritization and the detailed questions is emblematic of that kind of level of discussion that the council needs to prepare for going forward, and how it's going to be able to kind of deal with these very kind of detailed, nuanced conversations. I mean, we just spent with 2.5 hours on a sentence, and admittedly it's an amendment to the plan, but the council really needs to think long and hard about what it's going to be doing going forward, how it's going to do it, and what kind of support it needs, and being real candid with the legislature about those resources.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Okay. So in the interest of time, these are the three things I've heard. Oh, sorry, Abby, I see your hand now. Go ahead.
I just would like to back up what Chris offered. I'm very concerned about the capacity issues in this regard, particularly if it involves a prioritization framework that would have to be, at least in our subcommittee, I think we would have to create one. And I just don't see where that capacity is going to come from where that capacity will come. Apologies.
Yeah. So I'm hearing three things. I'm just going to drop them in the chat right now of three sort of options for moving forward. And one is to send it back to subcommittees, right? The other, with all the caveats Abby is saying, the other is create some sort of subcommittee chair and steering committee group that invests time in this. And the third I'm hearing is saying, thank you for respecting our work, and we simply can't do that. We're going to be focusing on our January report to you, and our bigger conversation about how we're going to invest our time in 2023 and 2024. So that's what I'm hearing are three options. And unless someone wants to quickly shout out a fourth option, I just want to test people. This is not a vote, folks, but I'm just testing people's appetite in the chat between 1, 2, and 3. Like if counselors could just say, among those three options, I'm inclined towards 1, 2, or 3, that would be a helpful temperature check of how people want to handle this. Thanks, Erica and Chris. Others, if you had to choose between the three. Okay. Other counselors have an opinion? Okay. So if you all are looking at the same thing I'm looking at in the chat, what I'm seeing is a number of you feeling like, wow, we really should focus on other things. However, there's also a number of you saying, hey, if somebody asks, it's best to have some kind of response. So in that, it looks like getting a small group together with co-chairs and the steering committee could be a way to do some kind of response. That's what I'm seeing in the chat. Joey, Erica?
I agree with Liz and Sue that it is important to respond. I also agree with Chris that we have very limited capacity, and Abby, who also noted that. I agree. One thought would be, again, this is it's largely new incoming cohort of legislative members. Could it be, I mean, part of me is like, choose 3, thank JFO for their input, and then offer for members of the subcommittees who are steeped in this to come in before the committees of jurisdiction and appropriations and make their case. It feels like we've got words on a page. There's a tremendous amount of work and good thinking and expertise that has gone into putting those recommendations on a page. Ultimately, it's the decision of the legislature, and it may be helpful to inform that decision with some more information from the subcommittees. Anyway, that's just a thought, maybe more a way to scratch that itch in a little bit different way.
Okay. Erica?
I definitely agree that when JFO or legislature asks for something, we should respond, but putting them back to the subcommittees continually pits the subcommittees against one another. And it doesn't allow us to resolve what our existential question is what's more important here, emissions reductions or adaptation? And I feel that's what it's going to come down to with budget prioritization. If we have to put this back to the subcommittees and make us fight it out, I would request respectfully that the council weigh in on this as a whole so that the council is determining what is important here.
Got it. Right. So it's very tricky to push it back to the subcommittees. Yep. Abby?
Yeah, that was kind of the thrust that where I was headed. And also to Joey's point, I just think too, based on the legislators that I've been able to speak with about this, I don't think that there's a full grasp or understanding of sort of the compressed timeline resulting in this siloed approach that we've by necessity had to take, that to Erica's point is pitting us against one another in ways that are not servicing kind of the holistic vision of where the state, I think, is attempting to go in terms of how it's thinking about its climate strategies broadly, whether they're emission reduction or adaptation or resilience. And so if I agree that it's good that they asked for a response and that we should offer them something, but perhaps part of that response should be, one, we don't have the capacity to do this work that you continue to ask us to do. I mean, I'll just say it again, I was told 2 years ago that there was going to be stipends for people like me to serve in this role, and that's never even happened. I think the legislature needs to understand what the challenges are that face us as subcommittees and people trying to thoughtfully do this work, and the challenges that the law itself poses, to Erica's point, where it's pitting these priorities against each other that we cannot afford to pit against each other. They're all important. We have to reduce emissions. We also have to adapt our communities and create resilience within them. This is a both and, this is not an either or. And that's how we've been forced to sort of navigate these conversations. I think it's really damaging. And that's a lot. I don't really know how to neatly sum that up and put that forward in a response to any of this, but I think that that's something that's going on here. Is we have not been given the resources to appropriately do this work. We've received a lot of critique from all different sides because of those different realities. And I just think that part of it has to be addressed at some point too.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah. Rich?
Yeah, I just want to speak up in support of what both Erica and Abby and Chris have said. As much as we might like to take this on and provide guidance on these issues, we need to report to the legislature that we don't have the resources, staff, or time to do the job they're asking us to do here. And in the absence of that, the the challenge of balancing across adaptation, mitigation, and resilience is at this point in time not something that the council itself can resolve. And I just think we should speak plainly about that. And I would suggest that perhaps the steering committee could draft something to that effect that the council as a whole could reflect on in a future meeting.
Great. Okay. So to be clear, it sounds like what's being suggested is a response is crafted, but the response is essentially getting into the things that you all in the last three speakers or so have said. And the steering committee could craft that and you could approve that in your next meeting. Does that seem like a good pathway forward for this? And we have notes on what was just said in terms of those key pieces. Sue says thumbs up. That's great. Thanks. Okay. Any concerns about moving forward in that pathway? Okay. Let's move forward with that pathway. So we've got a really tricky situation right here with 2 items on the agenda that we thought, plus some public comment we wanted to do, and we're very tight up against the time. I'm not sure the right path here, but I will recommend the following, which is I think we should push the conversation on planning for the January report to your next meeting, unless there is something urgent that folks want to say right now about that. And for biomass, we could give folks 5-10 minutes to say what they, give them a quick update and just run our meeting about 10 minutes late for that. And that would be my suggestion, so that we are respectful of people who showed up to this meeting thinking they would have a chance to say something, and recognizing we can't really go much more than 10 minutes beyond our meeting. So that would be my recommendation. Let me and I know a number of you have a couple of hard stops. Quick check-in on the issue of the January report. Is there anything mission critical that folks want to say right now, in addition to this needs to be part of your December meeting? Anything mission critical on that? Okay. Great. In terms of biomass, I know folks have been waiting patiently here. There is a document that was shared, which is an emerging draft document on the biomass stuff. I wonder if someone from that task group wants to just give the sort of, 5-minute version of where you are in your process, and how you'll be asking, or what you'll be providing to the council and when in that process. So I'll invite, I'm not quite sure who's going to do that. I know, Liz, you've been part of that process. Others might be.
Can I do 30 seconds and introduce?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, everybody. Biomass Task Group continues to do quite a bit of work. We are working through a set of recommendations that have not yet garnered consensus among all task members, though we are getting closer, particularly on portions of that recommendation. So we'll, I believe, be in a position either to present a set of recommendations to the council for consideration, or if necessary, in some limited areas, alternatives for consideration. We've invited subcommittees to recent meetings, which was, I found very helpful. I believe other task members did as well. And mostly, I just want to introduce, because he's been attending the meeting today, hoping to just have a chance to amplify Richard Hopkins, who's a member of the task force with me, so that he can say a few words more substantively about what it is we've been looking at and where we are in the process with that short introduction. Richard,
no,
thank you.
actually, I'm fine. Let's move on.
Great. All right. Thanks, Richard. So I think with that, Richard and Liz, I mean, do you want to say a word about where you're, anything else about content or anything like that?
I don't think it's necessary. There's a draft posted here, listed as it should be, is not yet consensus by the task group, but it'll show you certain areas highlighted or commented on where we're still working through. And it really comes down to issues regarding how the study to look at if, when, and how, or when and how, depending upon which task members you're speaking with, the current plants are retired. That's one of the issues, and there are others, but that's, as you'll see in the draft document, one of the areas of continued discussion. I don't think there's more really at this point to add, David, given how the meeting has gone.
Super. Okay. Well, thanks, Liz, and thanks others who've been involved in that work. Really appreciate that. Let's do a round of any final public comment that folks would have about who folks have been listening into our meeting today. Final things they'd like to bring up before we end our meeting. Observers, folks, members of the public who've been joining us today, any last comments that haven't been said already? Cheryl Joy, go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. I know this was a really long and difficult meeting. So I was hoping to make comments after hearing a bunch of stuff about the biomass task group from, Liz and
Richard.
And Richard, sorry, thank you. Right, but you can read that report, and it is funny a little. I'll just say something really briefly, is that it's very apparent for anyone who has looked at data and research on biomass combustion that it's not the answer. It's worse really than all of the fossil fuels, including coal, which is hard to get worse than that, isn't it? But the thing is that you have to think about people's views on, we really have to look at equity and just transition, et cetera. So that's the big thing. But people are looking mostly, and they're hedging on really saying, all right, let's shut it all down because of economic reasons. I'm pretty sure, because the writing is on the wall. It really needs to end. Combustion in general needs to end. So having said that, there's tons more to say about it, but that's it. I know it's over. The meeting's over. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Cheryl Jo. And this council will be taking up the substance of that biomass conversation in a subsequent meeting when the task group's ready to pass on the document to the council. Okay, anybody else with a comment for today? Okay.
Hey, David.
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Like I said, this may be my last meeting, so I'll just say, as you guys progress, those in the administration that are on this council have a real position of power and influence that other councilors don't. So I know this process can be frustrating at times, but really need to respect those positions of power and not necessarily drill in on other councilors that don't have that same power. So as you guys go forward, try to keep it as civil as possible, and wish the council well.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure everyone's going to miss your presence on here if this is indeed your last meeting. All right. We'll have to do some other send off for Chris or anybody else who will be leaving. I want to thank everybody. Today was a frustrating day from a process standpoint, so I think there was some important learning on that. And if anyone wants to reach out to me and talk about that and about how to make sure we don't, get all muddled up in process as we're going forward, I'm happy to have that conversation. And I apologize, it was pretty clunky today in how we worked on that. So I'd welcome some feedback on that, and would, happy to have people reach out. Thanks everyone for hanging in there today. Take care. There's a meeting in December. There's important stuff to work on in December as well. And we have the next steps from this meeting laid out. Last words, take care, folks. Thanks, Chris, if this is really the last one. Take care.